of the state of intelligence in the United States today. And as all of you know, our guest is eminently qualified to do this. He's spent 6 important years in senior positions at the Central Intelligence Agency. He was first counselor to the Director of Intelligence, then Mr. Tenet, and then served as Executive Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the number 3 position at that institution. 2 wonderful positions that put him very much in the center of things at the agency, and will make tonight's presentation very impressive. Intelligence, of course, is one of those very important centerpieces of our foreign policy. The community that does it are guardians of the society, in a sense. And on the other hand, today many people are concerned about what they think have been intelligence lapses over the past few years, and some severe questions about reorganization within that institution. Mr. Krongard, as you know, was with Alex Brown for a long time, ended his career there as the CEO and the chairman of the board, before it was merged, of course, with Bankers Trust, which he then served as chairman of the board, for which he served chairman of the board. And then, of course, presently today he's with PHH as chairman of that board. Incidentally, along the way, he's a Princeton graduate, I should say a City College graduate as well, Princeton, University of Maryland Law. But what's most important are those wonderful years of experience at the Central Intelligence Agency. It's my great pleasure to present Mr. A.G. Buzzy Krongard.
Thank you. In the interest of full disclosure, I should say that I think the papers carried something that I'm also going on the global board of Piper Rudnick, so I hope you didn't drink too much, because I'll be looking at the bottom line there. I guess I want to start off with a curveball. My initial title I've decided to change, and I've changed it twice. The first change, I was going to call the speech An Insider's Perspective on Intelligence and Its Role, and then I've changed it to A Former Insider's Director on Intelligence and Its Role. And as you know, I left the agency in the late fall of 2004, which means that I've been out of touch and can't say I know everything that's going on there, which may put me in the same boat as the people that are running it now. But by way also of introduction, let me just, I was counselor to the director, which was the best job I think I've ever had in my life, because I had unlimited perceived authority and no responsibility, which for about 18 months let me just wander through everywhere, and I don't think anyone in the history of the agency has ever been in so many different places inside the building and out, because I really didn't have a job except to wander around. And then as executive director, the job, for those of you with a corporate background, that would be like the chief operating officer, and that was basically to run the agency on a day-to-day business, leaving the director and the deputy director free to do the things, strategy and briefing the president and things like that. So I can't tell you that the conclusions I'm going to share with you tonight are terribly valid or valuable, but I did certainly have a catbird seat to a lot of stuff that went on in an interesting time. So tonight, I'd like to offer some thoughts on the nature of intelligence and make some comments on the progress that the CIA, in partnership with other members of the intelligence community, law enforcement, and our armed forces, had made on the war on terrorism. And finally, I'll try and offer some thoughts on the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission and the hard choices that our political leaders will be making about intelligence reform. And there's so much at stake for all of us. These are very, very difficult decisions. I want to start by talking about the CIA. I doubt that there is another organization in the world that has had as much erroneous and sometimes malicious information attached to it as the Central Intelligence Agency. They are either James Bond or Maxwell Smart. They're either capable of anything because they have a lack of moral center, or they're totally incapable of doing anything because they're grossly incompetent. Now, this is understandable if wrong, for America has never been completely comfortable with the notion of espionage. Unlike our British cousins, who trace their spy routes at least to Walsingham, we as a nation have always had our doubts about the utility and the propriety of the dark side of the diplomatic arts, i.e. intelligence. It was an American, after all, Secretary of State Stimson, to be exact, who said, and I quote, "Gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's mail," a notion the very gentlemanly French must find quite amusing. In my judgment, our national skepticism is actually a good thing. There ought to be uneasy feelings about the need for a secret organization in an open democratic society, and such an organization needs to continually demonstrate its utility and to hold its officers to the highest standards. I would not want to live in a country that is too comfortable with secret organizations and not demanding of its officers. So if not James Bond or Maxwell Smart, then who? CIA the numbers are very small, just a few, and if you asked anyone why they chose to work at CIA, and certainly myself included, almost all would answer with the same thing: the mission. And the mission is to safeguard American democracy, to protect American lives, to advance America's interests. Intelligence is the first line of America's defense, and sometimes the only tool the President has to take the fight to those who would do us harm, take our liberty, our livelihood, imperil our children and our families. Intelligence officers labor in the shadows, often in ones and twos. They are in all the places in the world where the United States does not want to be seen, and in places where men hold power the United States does not want to be seen with. Working with people you wouldn't want in your home is a necessary evil in the business. It reminds me of my days on Wall Street. The goal is to gather information, some of it openly, but more commonly by stealing secrets. The people hold lives in their hands every day and, when necessary, put their own lives at risk. But it is expected to be smart about it. There is no room for daredevils or fools. There are 83 walls on the CIA Memorial Wall, more than one for each year of its existence. And they are a constant reminder not of the risks we run, but of the risks accepted. People are held to a very high standard. One takes great pride. Indeed, it is a core value in speaking truth to power. One does not shape or shave reporting to fit the season's political fashion, nor does CIA advocate or argue for a policy position. The responsibility is to be the unbiased voice conveying what we know, and as important, perhaps more important, what we do not know. And this is revealed to all who receive our reporting and analysis. This is not a recipe that wins many friends in Washington's hothouse political environment, but its core, it is the core to the agency, and it is essential to the mission. It is also an accepted axiom that intelligence is an imperfect business. We make mistakes. We've always made mistakes. We will always make mistakes. It's more art than science. And I assure you, then when they are made, they are acknowledged. More important, they are studied and hopefully corrected, and we learn from them. And this, too, is a core value, and sadly a rather rare one in Washington. Like many organizations, CIA has a vision, mission, and values statement, and like all such statements, it attempts to capture the essence of the organization. We saw ourselves as, quote, the eyes and ears of the nation, and at times its hidden hand. We provide objective, unbiased information and analysis. Our mission requires complete personal integrity, personal courage, physical and intellectual. We accomplish things others cannot, often at great risk. When the stakes are highest and the dangers greatest, we are there, and there first. Service, sacrifice, flexibility, teamwork, and quiet patriotism are our hallmarks, end quote. Now, all the dedication, skill, and daring of intelligence officers notwithstanding, there are limits to what intelligence can do. In particular, there are three things intelligence cannot do. First, intelligence cannot predict the future. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or a year from now, and no one at the CIA knows. While intelligence cannot predict the future, though, it can help elected officials understand the forces that shape the future, the perspective and tendencies of our adversaries, and the risks and opportunities in any situation for the United States. Second, intelligence cannot and should not dictate policy. Policy is the realm of elected officials, and many other ingredients go into a policy decision besides intelligence, not the least of which is domestic politics. We elect officials to do things, to make decisions, and that involve trade-offs. Intelligence is almost always just one of the factors involved, and frankly, generally not the most important one. What intelligence and the agency can and should do is to inform policy, illuminate the consequences of choices, including choosing not to choose. And lastly, and perhaps most important in these times, intelligence cannot remove risk. In and of itself, intelligence cannot guarantee your safety. It can help reduce risk, understand risk, manage risk. It can warn of threats. It can help carry the battle to those who put us at risk. But intelligence alone cannot prevent a repeat of 9/11. When intelligence is working well, it is doing two things. First, it informs and elevates the policy debate, ensuring that all parties are working from the same information. It helps to bound the uncertainties that surround every policy choice. And second, at the end of the day, it is hoped that it makes our guy smarter than their guy, whether that is across a mahogany conference table or a battlefield somewhere in Central Asia. Intelligence is rarely, if ever, a seamless fabric of fact. Only in the movies does someone steal, quote, the plans. There are no plans. Governments don't work that way. Intelligence is the compilation of hundreds of bits of information, the dots, if you will. It is a fundamental truth of intelligence that the bits of information available will always be incomplete, often contradictory, and frequently suspect. Suspect in that the information may be intentionally false and an attempt to mislead, or suspect because the source of the information is uncertain or untrustworthy. There's a whole art in intelligence called D&D, deception and denial, where you intentionally are putting bad stuff out in hopes that it gets picked up by the rival service. All information, moreover, including information that seems obvious, like an intercepted conversation of a satellite photograph, requires considerable interpretation. Did the fellow on the telephone have direct knowledge of whatever it is he's apparently speaking about, or is he just gossiping? Does the new building with the extra security at the chemical plant mean chemical or biological weapons are being produced there, or simply that flammable supplies are being warehoused? Intelligence is like driving a car at speed down a twisting road while staring through a muddy windshield. Intelligence officers, unlike many who supervise us, whether they be in the Congress or the pundits or wherever, do not have the benefit of a clean rearview mirror. You're almost never completely wrong or completely right in the business. There are very few instances where the intelligence collected rises to the level of evidence required in a court of law, although that seems to be the standard that some would hold the agency to, especially after the fact. Intelligence officers can make an intelligence case that such and such a pharmaceutical plant may be producing chemical or biological weapons. But believe me, such case would not be compelling to a jury. Why? Because the dots are fuzzy and far apart. They're held together by assumptions and deductive reasoning. It's like putting a puzzle together, only you do not have the box top to tell you what the picture is. Moreover, many of the pieces of the puzzle are missing. Wrong pieces have been introduced, and there are very few straight lines. And usually there's a clock running somewhere because there's always a deadline by which a decision must be made or an action taken. Lives are on the line. Intelligence is the art of providing the best answer possible given the time and information available. And our answer is always subject to change because international relations is not static. And more time generally brings more, and one hopes, better information. Let me try and give you an example of the difficulty of what it means to be an intelligence officer and try and get something done. This is a recent case where the experts had many, many pieces of the puzzle, almost unimpeded access to the central actors, had no language barriers or encryption, and understood very well the process that was being analyzed. Still, the experts got it wrong. They looked at the precedents, they connected the dots, they made some assumptions, and they concluded that Howard Dean would win in Iowa and be the Democrat nominee for president. In early January, you could, quote, take that press and pundit judgment to the bank, end quote. It is much, much tougher when the dots are harder to gather, there are language and culture chasms to be bridged, and the information you seek is secret. But before I turn to some of the recent controversies in the topic of intelligence reform, I want to take a minute or two to walk you through the process. How do you spy? How do you be a spy? How do we recruit someone to spy on behalf of the United States, to commit treason against his or her country? Because it's an important lens through which the criticisms and solutions must be seen. I said earlier that the mission is about bounding uncertainty, creating knowledge, making our guy smarter than their guy. At the end of that day, that often comes down to spying, stealing secrets. But there's no point in risking lives to acquire something in a clandestine fashion that can readily be acquired openly. So a lot of time is spent acquiring and reading publicly available information. Then you're able to focus only on what the spies can collect. Incidentally, I used to always say that, I was sorry that the Russian thing had ended. I'd have been a fabulous Russian spy. I never would have had to spy. We give away so much information just out of scientific journals and newspapers and magazines. They would have thought I was their #1 agent. I could have been in Boca or Palm Beach or wherever you go and you want suntans or something. One of the most frequently voiced criticisms of CIA's performance on Iraq is that we had too few human sources, spies who could tell us about WMD. And this is a fair criticism. And much of what we were doing in the last 5 years was attempting to rebuild a capability that, thanks to the Congress, was eroded during the 1990s. This criticism, while fair, rarely acknowledges how difficult this is in practice. And now I'm going to give you a little study and try and explain why. Let's say I ask you to recruit an agent who can provide information on a country's nuclear weapons program. Where do you start? Well, you start by identifying the people who are working on the program or know something about it. How many people are there that can provide truly critical information? Probably just a handful. Let's say there are 24 people who have access to the information I've asked you to steal. It will take weeks and even months to identify these people and to begin to build rudimentary knowledge about them. It is a secret program, after all. Once you have done this, you must identify who in the group might be willing to share information with the United States, that is, commit espionage on our behalf. This will be a remarkable individual. He or she must be smart, resourceful, able to stand the pressure that they'll be under, and have the courage to follow through, knowing that a horrible death awaits them and their families if discovered or even suspected in many countries. Due process is not the rule in the places where this effort occurs. So let's say that 3 of the 24 candidates are deemed possibilities. You must now get close to each one, begin the process of assessing and cultivating. But how do you get close to them? They don't travel out of their country, at least not often. They live in a police state. You cannot travel there, at least not easily, and certainly not as an American. And if you did, how would you arrange to bump into your candidates? So you do the next best thing. You find assets and then recruit someone else, a non-American, who can travel there and has a reason to make the acquaintance with your targets. This also takes weeks, if not months. So let's say your access agent is able to meet, assess, and cultivate your target, again over a period of weeks and months. Now you have the challenge of introducing a CIA officer to the target, and that means either you go in or you wait until the target travels. This takes time, but again, let's assume you're successful and you're able to establish a relationship and you conclude that the target has access to information we want, has the inclination and the aptitude for espionage. It's also possible that you may discover that the target does not have access to the information you want or is unlikely to commit espionage successfully, in which case you go back to square one and you start over. But for the sake of argument, let's say you are both good and lucky in this instance. You still have to convince the target to cooperate with the United States at the risk of his life and the lives of his family. We do not coerce or blackmail. People decide to cooperate for a range of reasons. We hope because they're sympathetic to the goals, I'm laughing, goals of the United States and they want the benefits that life in the U.S. has to offer. However, more often they're influenced by money, romance, or pique. So-and-so got promoted and I didn't, my nose is out of joint, and therefore, I'll show them how really smart I am and da-da-da. So you make your pitch and the target accepts. It's now months, maybe years after you started. The agent still has to be trained in espionage, told what to collect, communicated with, debriefed, paid, and rescued if necessary. This takes time. And at the end of the day, the agent's information may not be all that valuable, perhaps because it duplicates what we already know, or it's questionable in some other way. But let's say again that you're good and you're lucky and the agent has the aptitude and the access we had hoped for. And he then begins to provide the famous dots that still must be interpreted and collated with other information. Congratulations, you've penetrated the nuclear program. Go to, the do not pass go or collect 200 or whatever you're supposed to do in that game. Now, repeat everything that I've gone through for the biological weapons program, the chemical weapons program, the inner circle of leadership, and everything else. My point is simply this. Espionage is a long, hard, expensive process. There are many, many ways things can go wrong, and one recruitment rarely, if ever, gives you everything you need. You do not just turn it on and off, especially after a decade of disinvestment. It takes years to rebuild agent networks that have been lost, compromised, or allowed to go silent. I want to discuss now performance, particularly as it relates to 9/11, Iraqi WMD, and the war on terrorism. Red meat, throw it out there. For you questioners who are sitting on the edge of your seat. And by the way, my view of 9/11 from day one, it differed from Director Tenet's a bit, was, in answer to the question, was 9/11 an intelligence failure? I've always said yes, because it occurred. The question is not that. The question is there culpability? But we'll talk some about that. In late September, we're going to start with 9/11. A little more than 2 weeks after the attack on the Twin Towers in the Pentagon, armed with little more than some new authorities and promises of additional resources, the first agency officers, led by a friend of mine named Gary, flew into Afghanistan on an agency-owned Russian-made Mi-17 helicopter with a metal suitcase containing $3 million and a clear mission: find al-Qaeda, destroy them. Others followed Gary, and by early December, the Taliban's grip on Afghanistan was broken. The great al-Qaeda sanctuary was gone. And in Gardez, a handful of CIA officers and Special Forces personnel, none in uniform, dirty, bearded, and tired, knelt and buried a piece of the World Trade Center in the heart of what was once enemy territory. I think the 9/11 Commission did an excellent job examining and chronicling the events leading up to the attacks. It captured the situation in the intelligence and law enforcement communities as it existed in the fall of 2001. Its findings as they relate to the need for more human intelligence, greater analytic depth, more foreign language capability in the government, and especially greater information sharing are recommendations we all embrace. And indeed, you need to know that we were aware of these weaknesses even before the committee's findings and had been hard at work to correct them since 1998. If I were to take exception to anything in the Commission's findings, it would be this: the finding that there was a lack of imagination on the part of the U.S. government. Speaking personally, I think of the agency in those months and years before 9/11 as a Cassandra of sorts. We had been warning about terrorism in general since the early 1990s, and former Director Tennett's pleas in his annual testimony to Congress on worldwide threats had grown more strident from 1997 on. In February 2001, he told the Congress that, quote, "The threat was real, immediate, evolving, that Osama bin Laden was the most immediate and serious threat, and he was capable of multiple attacks with little or no warning," end quote. Throughout the summer of 2001, we had seen a sharp rise in threat reporting. The reporting was maddeningly short on details, but it was clear something big was being planned. We gave the reporting wide dissemination, and the executive and legislative branches of government were alerted to our concerns. In its report, the 9/11 Commission states that no agency did more to attack al-Qaeda before 9/11 than the CIA. Unfortunately, it was not enough. That said, at the end of the day, we who were working at CIA must live with the fact that while we were able to provide strategic warning, we were unable to penetrate the network or steal the secret that would have provided specific information needed to preempt the attack, as we had so many others. I, for one, will carry that knowledge with me forever. I see speculation in the media from time to time that if only this piece of information had been passed up the line or that action taken, then perhaps the tragedy would have been avoided. Well, perhaps. The 9/11 Commission lists 10 missed opportunities to disrupt the plot, although it admits how difficult it would have been to make sense of the fragments available. And I cannot readily take exception to such speculation because perhaps it would have. I don't know. I would only add 4 what-ifs of my own. What if intelligence resources and capabilities had not been drawn down so dramatically in the 90s? Our budget was cut 22%. What if political leaders had chosen to invest some small portion of the billions spent on collection systems on analytic tools instead that would have enabled analysts to better exploit the information collected? What if the rules put in place post 9/11 permitting information sharing between intelligence and law enforcement agencies had been in place before 9/11? Sometimes in questions, in an answer, I say that prior to the Patriot Act, it was illegal. For example, if NSA intercepted a call from bin Laden and an American citizen, they had to hang up, much less they couldn't tell the CIA about it. And people say, that couldn't be. Trust me, it was. And finally, what if the media had not compromised certain sensitive intelligence capabilities, including the fact that we could, and at one time did, intercept bin Laden's phone calls? 1 hour after this appeared in a certain paper in New York, that phone went dead forever. I can't say any of this would have made the crucial difference. I do know that it would have reduced the odds of stealing the secrets. Why didn't we get it? Well, first, we didn't steal the secret that told us what the plot was, despite an enormous effort to do so. We failed. Second, the government, including CIA, did not integrate all the data it had properly. And there was probably data the government had that the government didn't know it had. Third, our defensive measures, such as visa policies, watch lists, border controls, airport security, etc., did not keep the terrorists from entering the United States and exploiting our vulnerabilities. Iraq, WMD. For those of you who don't know, WMD stands for Weapons of Mass Destruction. I thought I'd instruct you in that. CIA's performance on Iraq WMD is the muddy windshield problem I spoke of earlier. Looking back, clearly there were deficiencies in some ways. The Iraq WMD is a case study in the limitations of intelligence. As I stressed at the start, we acknowledge, correct, and study our errors. And when I left, we were in the process of extracting lessons learned from this experience and transferring it in our training classes for analysts and collectors. How then did we arrive at the judgments we made, and what precisely were these judgments? There were three streams of evidence that intelligence officers looked at when trying to bound the uncertainty surrounding the extent of Iraq's WMD program. Iraq's history of processing and using WMD, the inability of the United Nations to account for all the weapons that Iraq admitted having, and new intelligence gathered from human agents, satellite photos, intercepted communications, and defectors. Using the information available to us and marching to a timeline set by Congress, the intelligence community, not just CIA, but all the various intelligence entities in the U.S. government and many foreign governments, concluded that, one, Saddam was continuing to expand his missile programs in violation of UN resolutions. Two, Saddam did not have a nuclear weapon, was probably several years away from having one, but that he wanted one, and he was intent on reconstituting the program. In addition, a big thing with these programs is if you have money, of which he had a great deal, you can buy from the North Koreas and the Irans the missing piece parts, and that's hard for us to know what is lacking and what is for sale on the market. And believe me, there are some places in the world where you can buy pretty much anything. Saddam had biological and chemical weapons, and moreover, these programs were larger and more advanced than before the first Gulf War. After the war, we discovered that the nuclear program was about where we thought it was. The missile program was further along, and the chemical and biological programs were less capable than we thought. So the record's mixed on these points. I believe we accurately described the regime's ties to terrorism and the risks in the post-war situation for the United States, but that's a subject of some debate. That said, I don't think our work was up to the standards that we set for ourselves as professionals. And I look back at the work we did, I'm not pleased with the precision of the language we used in our analysis. It was inconsistent. We did not make as clear as we should have what we knew and what we did not know. I believe we could have done more to question some of our assumptions and could have asked other questions which we did not. Nor do I think we probed the evidence as hard as we should have. There are many contributing factors to these, but they don't change my core criticism. I would add as an aside that an organization that can take apart its own work, find mistakes, and draw lessons learned, which are then incorporated into its training, is not an organization in denial or laboring under a broken corporate culture, as some assert. It's an organization doing a very difficult job and that is committed to doing it better. Before leaving this subject, there are two other points to be made. First, I want to take issue with a number of myths that seem to grow up around the still classified NIE on Iraq weapons of mass destruction. That document did not advocate going to war. Again, we don't advocate policy positions. Analysts did not change judgments to meet the needs of the administration, and the judgments in the estimate were not news to Congress. Divergent views were not buried in the document, nor uncertainties concealed. The Niger yellow cake story did not underpin the judgment on Saddam's nuclear program. I would also add that Iraq under Saddam was a very dangerous place. It was a threat to U.S. interests and allies. It was a source of instability, a long-term proliferation threat, and a very evil regime guilty of unspeakable crimes against its own people and its neighbors. The second point is that intelligence in general, and espionage in particular, has been and will continue to be responsible for significant breakthroughs on proliferation issues. something that's very easy to forget in the current climate. It was classic espionage by the CIA that led Libya to dismantle its WMD program, that forced recent Iranian missions about its nuclear program, and that broke the back of the A.G. Khan nuclear proliferation network. That's CIA at its best. Let me now turn to the war on terrorism. The terrorist target is in many ways the toughest target CIA has ever faced. Terrorists are smart, they are disciplined, and they practice excellent security. Their cells are small, the members are often related. They distrust people they do not know. They study our vulnerabilities, our techniques, and their own mistakes. They learn, they evolve, they get better at what they do. But we have had remarkable success against them since 9/11. It was imaginative covert action by our officers working hand in glove with the military that drove the Taliban from power and destroyed al-Qaeda's Afghan sanctuary. It is the CIA working closely with the FBI and other law enforcement partners that is draining al-Qaeda of its lifeblood, money, and working together as a team, with CIA acquiring scraps of information from abroad and the FBI and law enforcement following up on these leads. Here, we have broken extremist cells right here in the United States. Most importantly, nearly 3/4 of al-Qaeda's pre-9/11 leadership is dead or detained, and almost every instant taken down by aggressive CIA clandestine action. And in addition, over 3,400 lower-level members have been taken off the streets, again, either dead or detained. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, al-Qaeda's operations chief and the mastermind of 9/11, will never threaten America again. Nor will Nashiri, the senior planner for the Arabian Gulf, or Abu Zubaydah, or Hassan Ghul, or Hariri al-Makki, who were behind the bombing of the USS Cole, or Hambali, the senior planner for Southeast Asia, and the list goes on and on. And I believe it's just a matter of time before bin Laden himself is captured or killed. Barring that, one day he'll die of natural causes and we'll take the credit. We will never stop hunting him. We will not rest, and we'll get him. And as the President has said, we'll bring them to justice or bring justice to them. Now, this success is attributable to changes made immediately after the attack. We did not wait for the 9/11 Commission to report. Some of the changes are internal to CIA. Others are the result of changes in national priorities or new authorities. Our policies, the nation's and the intelligence communities, have changed. Where once the pattern was wait and react, we're now on the offensive against terrorists worldwide. Practices have changed. Intelligence, law enforcement, and military officers now serve together and share information real time on the front lines at home and abroad. Our worldwide coalition has changed. It's broader, deeper, and more committed. Now, don't say, well, how come we fight on it? I'm talking about this is in the war against terrorism, where there's much greater international cooperation. Where terrorists found sanctuary before, they find our allies now, and we are seeing the results around the world. Our laws have changed. The Patriot Act has given us weapons in the war we did not have, and we have saved many lives because of them. Our institutions have changed. NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center, formerly TTIC, the Terrorist Threat Integration Center, enables us to combine intelligence collected abroad with law enforcement information collected at home. And plots have been stopped in the U.S. because of that. 26 different data networks now flow into NCTC to be shared by officers from the widest array of foreign and domestic intelligence agencies ever assembled in one organization. We did that. People who think we can't break down the so-called stovepipes need to visit NCTC. You may be aware of the recent string of arrests in Great Britain and Pakistan that link with the links back to the U.S. Behind these arrests is the work of the agency in close collaboration with other intelligence and law enforcement communities and with their foreign partners. Plotting has been disrupted, but we are very concerned about the possibility of another major attack in the U.S. Clearly, that is their intent. Clearly, they are working hard to make that happen. Success is notwithstanding, we are nowhere near ending the threat of terrorism here in this country. and even the capture of bin Laden would not significantly diminish the short-term threat, in my judgment, nor would it mean the end of al-Qaeda. Sunni extremism is growing, and al-Qaeda's destructive expertise has received wide dissemination, guaranteeing that this threat will outlive anyone in this room. For those in the intelligence profession, there's a hard reality. CIA successes will always be out of public view. Terrorist successes will always be very public. Our guys have to be perfect every day. They have to just be lucky once. Our guys live every minute with the prospect of catastrophic failure. Success is measured by what does not happen, and we know there will never be a headline in the New York Times that says, quote, "Great job, CIA, no terrorist threat today or attack." I'm going to close with the debate on intelligence reform. There are many proposals now on the table to reform or repair intelligence, and it is vital that any fix or reform address the problems of today, not the shortcomings of 3 years ago. I'll put my bias right up front. I believe there is more right than wrong with the community, and that the greatest problems were resources and the willingness and ability to share information. Congress and the Patriot Act have gone a long way towards fixing these, and I realize that this is a minority view and that there are things that can be done to strengthen U.S. intelligence further. Rather than discuss the various proposals, I would offer some first principles to keep in mind as you assess the numerous plans. First, speed and agility are the keys in the war on terrorism, and they are profoundly important to the nation's other intelligence challenges. Speed and agility are not promoted by complicated wiring diagrams, more levels of bureaucracy, increased dual hatting, or inherent questions about who really is in charge. Responsibility and accountability must be matched with commensurate authority. Second, as in architecture, form should follow function. During the Cold War, the function was to follow large strategic developments in a bipolar world. Today, the focus is more on locating individuals, tracking shipments of dangerous materials, and understanding politics down to the tribal level in a world where the only constant is change. The structure must facilitate agility, flexibility, and speed. Third, clear structure and a clear chain of command are better than the opposite. Putting everything under one roof will not of itself break the stovepipes. I believe that short, clean lines of command and control are essential in whatever structure is established, regardless of what the leader is called or what who he or she reports to. The great Navy Admiral Hyman Rickover once said that if you cannot point your finger at the man or woman who is responsible for something, then no one has ever been responsible. Fourth, some competition is good. I've spoken of the uncertainties and limitations inherent in intelligence. Because evidence can be interpreted in many different ways, we want all the interpretations on the table and an intelligence community that facilitates vigorous, rigorous debate, not groupthink. Beyond the first principles, there are two other core issues that must be addressed, and as yet I've not heard anyone speak to either issue. They are very difficult because they go to core American values and involve difficult trade-offs. The first is resources. There was a conscious decision to cut intelligence resources after the end of the Cold War, and with that came a reduction in capability. So how much is enough? The more that is spent on defense and intelligence, the less there is for other needs, including healthcare, education, roads, public infrastructure, etc. But war is a come-as-you-are party. If you do not have the intelligence sources in place before you need them, they will not be there when you do need them. Steady, sustained investment is required. The other trade-off involves privacy. The more information that is available to the community, and the Patriot Act has been vital in this regard, the greater our ability to connect the dots. But it is also true, the greater ability to connect the dots, the greater the potential for abuse. Where do you strike the balance? Only you and your elected representatives can determine what that proper balance should be on these two issues. It is not a decision for intelligence officers. Intelligence professionals ask for only two things. First, a clear definition of the mission. What is it precisely you expect? Perfection? And the resources with with which they are asked to do the job. Second, an agreed set of rules on how we are to do that mission, and then hold us to that standard. Do not reinterpret the rules to fit the fashion of the day. The enhanced interrogation technique issue will be an interesting thing to watch unfold. These are big issues. Whatever comes out of the reform process should be deliberate, carefully thought out, vigorously explored and debated, and free of superheated political processes. Lives are at stake. The world today is very much changed. In the Cold War, we could talk to our adversaries. There was a general consensus of what was and was not acceptable behavior. Both sides had an interest in preserving the status quo, and the competition was largely on the margins. And most important, it was possible to work issues and through hard negotiations to come to mutually acceptable solutions. Now we have an adversary that does not have a territory to defend, has little interest in the status quo, and believe they have a religious obligation to kill all Americans. Age and gender do not matter, and a moral obligation to acquire and use weapons of mass destruction. The war on terrorism is the new reality, and we're going to be living with it for some time. And for terrorists, our homeland will remain the brass ring, and they will attempt to acquire and use WMD here. Israel and Great Britain have lived with terrorism for decades and survived, and we shall too. Israel and Great Britain have learned to have realistic expectations of what intelligence can do and not to turn on one another or rip their services to pieces after every incident. They remember who the real enemy is, and we must learn to do so also. For the first time since Appomattox, a war is being fought on our soil. And these people learn from their mistakes, and they are quick to exploit any vulnerabilities they identify. Notwithstanding the foregoing, I believe that the terrorists have far more to fear from us than we do from them. Because as we sit here, intelligence officers are very much on the offensive, making their way to clandestine meetings, often in hostile environments, not for money, not for fame, but to collect some bits of information in the hopes that it will shed light on the intentions or capabilities or whereabouts of those who would do us harm. We're working better than we ever have and know there is little margin for error, but there can be no let-up. And every day they must do better than the day before. And I'm confident that they will. Thank you.
Well, we thank you for Intelligence 101 and beyond, setting the stage nicely for whatever questions you may have. Would you comment on the complications of a chain of command which you try to centralize? Yeah, the problem. I
had more in mind the new Negroponte's job. In other words, in that whole thing, in the CIA, I mean, there's an organization that's been functioning over 50 years that this whole thing works, and the director doesn't worry about every single thing. I mean, it's a functioning organization. My comments were directed at the reorganization of the whole community, including the military, FBI, law enforcement, State Department, CIA, everything else.
Can you comment on the intelligence support for continuing an anti-missile program?
Again, what intelligence would do is to relate what the various missile threats are in the world. It would be either the military or other policy people who would then decide what to do about that, how they want to spend that money. And that's really a war essentially between the Pentagon and armed forces and appropriations and all that. We really didn't get involved too much, except to try and highlight, you know, what the threat is. For example, a big difference. Does Iran have a missile that can reach California or New York or Tel Aviv or somewhere else? We'd throw that in, and that may influence how much they're willing to spend on the development of an anti-missile defense system, but it's not pure intelligence work.
Two questions. The first was, who makes the decisions on covert operations? And then secondly, does the dual function of covert operations and intelligence gathering create a contradiction of any kind?
Okay, I'm bearing in mind that I was an investment banker. I'll take the second question first. No. I mean, the covert action thing has really got a fence around it. I mean, it really is separate and distinct. Your first question, I'll give you as much factual information as I'm free to share with you. I was the chairman of what was called the CARG, the Covert Action Review Group. So, you know, if there's one person in the agency that had the essential responsibility, it may have been I. But, and covert action, basically, we look at as something north of diplomacy and south of military action, where the United States hand is not want to be seen. How it works is the executive branch, the President, the National Security Council, decides that it's in the U.S.'s best interest to do X, destabilize the government of Baltimore, Maryland, right? So how you destabilize something destabilized, I don't know, but what they would then do, they'd give us sort of a conclusion, say, look, this is what we want to do. We would then come up with a number of scenarios, basically, that would go up to them, and ultimately, this would come down in what's called a finding signed by the President of the United States that said, you know, in accordance with the interests and aims of the United States government, I find it, blah, 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 and then it gives us specific authorities. Covert action is the hairiest and most covert and closeted thing we do. It's very contained. There are not, I mean, I think you'd be surprised at how few actually covert action findings there are. And I mean, you have to have it. You just have to have it. You can't have an intelligence service without it. And that's really where you hit the big casino. That's where some of the real good stuff gets done.
How does one cope with groupthink?
Okay, I only know what we tried to do when I was there. I don't have a clue as to what's being done there. We established routinely red cells or red teams, whatever you want to call them, the Advocatus Diaboli in the Catholic Church, the devil's advocate, who explains and rebuts why Mother Teresa should be sainted. In other words, in order to maintain the currency of sainthood and things like that. So we took very good people and let them challenge and come out with exactly opposite conclusions and everything else, and fight it out. Another thing the military does well that I certainly tried to inculcate at the agency, and that is in any discussion, always let the junior person speak first, so he or she is not influenced by what senior people think. And finally, to get people to say, tell me black and white, don't come together gray. In other words, you know, for the leadership, let's hear it. If 9 people think X and one person thinks Y, it's imperative that that one person's view be espoused. So you try. Can you get it always? No.
2 questions. What is the role of religion in your analysis? Not your religion, but the examination you give to religion. And then secondly, do you monitor what's said in mosques?
Well, yes to both. In the mosques, yeah, whenever, you know, the problem is some of these mosques are very small and hardcore, but whenever we can, we have people keeping a close eye. And for, you know, in this country, I mean, as you know, there was a bit of a scandal raised in the prison system in this country with some of the stuff going on there. The other thing we try and do is influence the religious leaders. Now, my wife and I, a couple weeks ago, former Secretary of Defense William Cohen sponsored a conference in Florida that was better understanding between this world and the Muslim world, and they had people from all over the Muslim world there. We spent a long weekend talking about all these kinds of things. But you have to bear in mind, the reason why it's difficult, I think, to give you a clear answer is in the religion itself. I mean, when I say we, I mean Western civilization got over intramural religious wars, you know, the War of the Roses and the Crusades, and, you know, hundreds of years ago. Here you have Wahhabis and Sunni and Shiite killing each other, and even within those groups they're killing. I mean, so it's hard, and in fact, I raised a question at this discussion, and I said, let's assume there was no America and no Israel, which are supposedly the thorns in the side. I said, could the Muslim world get its act together on its own? Because, you have all these, look in Iraq, Americans aren't killing all those people in Iraq. There are other Iraqis doing it, and it's essentially over religious differences, which is very difficult for people like us to understand. So it's a hard thing for them to deal with.
Would you comment on tell-all books about the CIA?
Outrageous. I happen to, know most of the stuff in the books, and some of it is so clearly wrong that it's offensive. I think the agency probably was too lax in allowing some of the stuff to be published, but I mean, some of it is pure fiction, I assure you. So somebody asked me when my book was coming out, and I said there are very few things in life that you can count on, but that's one of them. There won't be no book.
Would you comment on the CIA's language capabilities?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's extraordinarily important and much more complicated than you think. You say to me, Buzzy, are you going to Cleveland today? And I say, yeah, I'm going to Cleveland today. You say to me, Buzzy, are you going to Cleveland today? And I say, yeah, I'm going to Cleveland today. The translation, the literal translation, is exactly the same. In this business, it gets you killed, that difference. So it's not enough to be able to order beer, in several different languages. You need almost a native, the idioms. You need a faculty that is very difficult. Now, we had, incredible amount of Russian language. We got French and Spanish speakers. Pashto, Urdu, Arabic, Farsi, How many can now, colleges, are starting to teach it and everything else, but up until 9/11 basically, or maybe, 1998 or something like that. I mean, there was but a handful of places where you could go. Now, hopefully we're also learning because, I don't see any reason why the competition cannot be benign, but China, is going to be a competitor to the USA, and you're seeing in colleges, as you well know, because your daughter heads a program at Princeton, Chinese being taught, but the real scarcity in the U.S., number one. Number two, I can anticipate your next question, and I know that the largest Iranian population outside of Iran is in the United States, but we can't get these people cleared. But they're all first generation. They all have relatives back in the old country. How do you, clear them from background investigation, all that sort of stuff? We're making progress woefully inadequately, but the problem, we set in motion 2 years ago a huge language initiative. It's bearing fruit. The percentage increases are 100, 200%, but that means instead of 3, you got 6 or 9. With bonuses and everything else. Huge problem.
It's been a marvelous evening. We thank you very, very much.